Well, it has been said that the generations, maybe by now, since the 1960s have experienced more change than any other time period, any other generation in the history of humanity, with the only possible exception being the agricultural revolution thousands of years ago. Within the past several decades, our society has experienced more change than at any other time in the history of our culture, in the history of our nation, in the history of our society. And just think about all the different things that have changed. One of the biggest ones is the internet. Being able to get online, being able to have access to the sum total of human knowledge and all kinds of things that are not very knowledgeable, we'll say. But we can have access to all of them through just a simple click of a button. In fact, I remind my kids when they talk about school and how certain subjects are hard and whatnot, and I tell them, don't forget, I made it through school without Google. Well, okay, yeah. That's just barely. C's get degrees. Anyways, we made it through. You think about phones, the technological advancement in phones and in emails and in texting. You think about transportation. Remember all through the past year or so, that Hyperloop was in a discussion about right here in Missouri, or if I remember correctly, you'd be able to travel from Kansas City to St. Louis in about 30 minutes. Is that about right? That's crazy that those things can happen. But that's where our society is in this course of change. Now, not all change is good, not all change is bad. Change is just change. And it's our job as Christians, as followers of Jesus, to interpret that change through a biblical worldview. What are some other major changes that have occurred? You think of the civil rights movement that began in the 60s, really, and then we're seeing more and more of that today. You think of gay marriage, homosexual marriage. You think of how everything has changed within our perception of family. You think about how our society and our culture can now be described as a post-Christian culture, about the changes that have occurred because of that. I think about the changes that happened when every single one of my math teachers in school were proven wrong when they told me that I will not be able to have a calculator in my pocket. Any of y'all math teachers say the same thing? Well, we showed them, didn't we? We sure did. But probably the area where we've seen the greatest amount of change in the past several decades is the area around sexuality. You see, our culture, it has a lot to say about sex. It has a lot to say about sexuality. Everywhere we go, we see our culture's view of sexuality on display. And then we're left with a choice. You see, our choice as followers of Jesus, as those that are pursuing the life that is only available within Him, our choice is to either engage in that conversation or to step back from it and let everyone else engage in that conversation. And when we do that, then we tend to become surprised when the conversation gets worse and worse and worse. You see, I heard someone say when I was preparing for this message that we should not be too embarrassed to discuss what God was not too embarrassed to create. Are you with me on that? And the Bible has a lot to say about sexuality. Our culture has a lot to say. God has a lot to say about sexuality. Now, within this umbrella that we're going to be navigating over the next few weeks, I am very, very much aware that many of us, perhaps all of us, have experienced brokenness, have experienced shortcomings and failures, have experienced hurt around this idea of sexuality. I am well aware that within this room, within people that are with us online, some of you have experienced outright sexual abuse and violence in your life. And for that, I want to say, I am so sorry to hear. And Jesus grieves with you. You see, our society tells us that when we experience those things, sometimes that makes us dirty, that makes us distant, that makes us unlovable. Jesus says, I am the God that makes all things new. Amen. Jesus says, I can give you new life, even within our sexuality. And so as we approach this topic, we want to do so with the tenderness and the gentleness that we see within Jesus. Because what happens far too often is when people are talking about sexuality, the different reasons and arguments behind different sides of everything within it, they forget that at the end of their arguments and the end of their rationales and the end of their ideas are people. People that are searching for their identity, people that are trying to discover who they are. And we can't forget the impact that our words and ideas and arguments and everything has on people. So with all of that in mind, let's jump in. Now, what does our culture say about sexuality? Well, one of the things that is quite prevalent today is what's known as hookup culture. Are you familiar with that? Hookup culture is where people who have just met each other for the first time feel the freedom and the permission and the endorsement of culture to sleep together, and then with no intentions whatsoever of remaining together afterwards. Sleep together, go their separate ways. And what's interesting is our culture, our society, and the society outside the church is beginning to see that hookup culture has failed. That the promises of hookup culture, that it would bring freedom, that it would bring joy, that it would bring great amounts of pleasure, are absolutely wrong. There was an article written in the New York Times, of all places, known for its Christian stances and Christian writings. And it says, and this is in 2018, the article is entitled, "What's Lust Got to Do with It?" Good question. All right. In here, the writer says this: "Getting naked and having sex with strangers is hard. We portray it as fun, and we pretend it's fun. But people crave intimacy, which is not easy to create in a hookup. That's why Britain," I imagine the author was British, I don't know. "That's why Great Britain, has just appointed a loneliness minister." You see, within this article, the author, she is making a connection between hookup culture and the epidemic of loneliness that we see all through, especially the Western world. I remember reading a survey, this has been a while ago, but they asked a simple question: how many close friends do you have? The number one answer by far, 0. And what she's doing here is making a connection between that. Now, she's not against hookup culture. That's not what the article is about. The article says here are some shortcomings about it. And you see that even more so as we go on here. Later, she says, no one wants to go back to sock hops and going steady, as if having a traditional view of sexuality is so far back and so far regressive. She says, but to attempt to separate emotions from sex is not only illogical, given that emotion intensely augments pleasure, but it is also impossible for almost all women. The promises of our culture's view of sexuality, that we can have all the fantasy and all the pleasure without any of the emotional attachment, she says, is an outright lie. It has failed us today. And people outside of the church are seeing that. Our secular friends are seeing the failures of their views on sexuality. They're seeing how it disconnects. Our cultural story about sexuality, we'll see more of that story here in just a little bit, it brings division. It disconnects sex from several different things, one of them being child rearing as one of the primary purposes. It takes that away from this idea of sexuality. It takes away the fullness that can be experienced within God's vehicle for sexuality, which is marriage. Less and less people are getting married, and less people are even desiring to get married. Now, getting married is not the end-all, be-all. We'll talk more about that too. But they're not getting married because they're finding the fulfillment of their sexual urges outside of marriage, and oftentimes even on the internet with a virtual person, not even a real person. Our culture's view of sexuality disconnects us from this idea of commitment. Commitment that comes when a man and a woman pledges to love each other for the rest of their lives. Our culture's view of sexuality says, well, if you get married and then later on you fall out of love with each other, just dissolve the marriage and move on. Now, as I've said, even just a little bit that we've covered so far, this can bring up a lot of sensitive issues for a lot of people. And so don't hear any condemnation or judgment or any of those things from me. It won't be here. What we're looking for instead is, what is God's heart for sexuality? God created it. What's his heart for it? And what we see when we ask that question of the Bible, we see that God desires, for our sake, God desires our sexual formation. God desires that we walk in obedience when it comes to our sexuality, because that is the only place that we can find blessing, that we can find the joy, that we can find the freedom that is promised through sexuality. And I want you to see this today. I want you to see this within the scriptures. You see, many, many years ago, a couple thousand years ago, there was this city called Corinth. And Corinth was not known for being a moral city. Corinth was known as being immoral to the extreme. In fact, the sexual ethos or ethic of Corinth greatly resembled our own today. And in many ways, it might even be even more far gone, more beyond what God proclaims and teaches. You see, within Corinth, if you were a person of means, if you had any level of wealth, you wouldn't get married because you loved the person. You wouldn't get married because your parents thought they were a great person. You think of arranged marriages. You got married as a business transaction more often than not. You got married to buy favor with that person's family or with society as a whole or with the government or with whatever. And so as a result of that, the married husbands and married wives, they would often seek sexual fulfillment outside of their marriage. That was seen as normal. It would have been crazy for a husband and a wife to say, we are going to be exclusive with each other. They did not have a category for that. But within this city, there was a church because God was moving in the lives of the people there. In fact, in this city, the ones that struggled greatly with all kinds of different immorality, when Paul writes the letter to them in verse 2 of the first chapter, he says, you are saints. God is calling you to be a saint. Church, you are saints. Not because of anything that we've done or haven't done. We are saints because of what God has done for us. And then God gives us that same call that he gave them. He says, and live out who you are. Live out your sainthood so that all can see it. But if you have your Bibles, open them up to the book of 1 Corinthians. 1 Corinthians, it's towards the end of the Bible, just a little bit after the Gospels. If you get to 2 Corinthians, you went too far. Go back. These numbers are helpful. 1 Corinthians, if you don't have your Bible, it'll be on the screen here in just a moment. But I want us to read in chapter 6. And here, Paul has been writing to them about a few different things, and then from earlier on, they had asked him some questions. And so now he starts to respond to those questions. He's quoting them, quoting their questions, quoting their statements, and then he's responding to it. So 1 Corinthians chapter 6, look at verse 12. And in my Bible, there's quotation marks around the questions that they are asking, the statements that they're making. Some of yours might not have that, but it will be up there. Verse 12, it says this, I have the right to do anything, you say, but not everything is beneficial. I have the right to do anything, but I will not be mastered by anything. You say food is for the stomach and the stomach for food, and God will destroy them both. Basically, they're saying if God didn't want us to live sexually promiscuous, why did he make it possible? And God responds to that. He says, the body, however, is not meant for sexual immorality, but for the Lord, and the Lord for the body. Verse 14, by his power, God raised the Lord from the dead. That's Jesus. And he will raise us also. Do you not know that your bodies are members of Christ himself? Shall I then take the members of Christ and unite them with a prostitute? He's asking that because the way that the pagans would worship at the time, is they would enlist a cult prostitute, and that was how they would worship their many different gods. Paul says, shall I unite the members of God with a prostitute? Never. Verse 16, do you not know that he who unites himself with a prostitute is one with her in body? For it is said, the two will become one flesh. But whoever is united with the Lord is one with him in spirit. Paul is saying about 2,000 years ago what our secular friends are discovering, that within sex, there is a unity, there is an intertwining of souls that occurs that is far beyond the physical. That within sexuality, there is much, much, much more than a simple physical act going on. Paul says, you, Corinthians, you saints, live out your sainthood, even in the midst of your sexuality. And he would say it to us today. You, people of CenterPoint, you saints, live out your sainthood, even in the midst of your sexuality. That Paul is saying that if sex is pursued in ungodly ways, in ways outside of the intentions that God created, that it does not bring joy. It does not bring freedom. It does not bring blessing. It brings destruction. It's a big deal, church. Oh, it's a big deal. Not something to be trifled with. So what do we do? If that's the case, what do we do? Look at verse 18. Flee from sexual immorality. Run away from it. Get away from it. All other sins a person commits are outside the body, but whoever sins sexually sins against their own body. Do you not know that your bodies are temples of the Holy Spirit, who is in you and whom you have received from God? You are not your own. You were bought at a price. Therefore, honor God with your bodies. When you feel the temptations to act out sexually, when you feel the temptations to let your eyes linger on a person as they walk by, which, by the way, Jesus talked about that, and he called that adultery. If you ever lust after a person, and do nothing about it, no physical reaction whatsoever. But if you lust after a person in your heart, Jesus says that's adultery. That's how high this standard is, oh church. That's why I said earlier, probably just about every one of us are broken in some way when it comes to sexuality. But when we feel those temptations, that's not the time to say, I'm going to stand here, I'm going to clench my fist, and I'm not going to give in. I'm not going to give in. I won't do it. I won't do it. Because if we do that, what are we thinking about the entire time? The temptation. We're thinking about the lust. We're thinking about the destruction. And what happens after you do that over and over and over again? You typically give in in order to get that tension to be gone. Instead, what we do and what we see the example in the scripture is, if here I'm seeing the temptation, see ya, I'm going over here. For some people, that means they end up quitting their jobs and get a new job because there was a big source of temptation there that they couldn't handle. Flee. Get away from it. What a lot of folks do, especially if you have teenagers in the house, young adults, anything, even though now it's far beyond those age demographics, is to put all kinds of software on the computer that won't allow adult websites to pop up. Flee from it. Don't have that option there and just clench your fist and say, I won't give in. Flee. Run away from it. That doesn't mean you don't have faith. It doesn't mean you're not strong in the Lord. It means you're wise in the Lord. You're wise to the ways God's created you, and you're aware of who you are deep down. Flee from it. Don't stand. And then that last little bit, honor God with your bodies. Our culture tells us today that our bodies are meant to honor ourselves more than anyone. And Paul says, no. Honor God with your body. How do we do that? Well, God has shown us. God has built a foundation on how to honor him with our bodies, and he's built it on some pillars of sexuality. There's 4 pillars of sexuality that I want to share with you today. And what these do, what they remind us of, is they take our eyes off of what our culture says about it and then lifts it up to what God says about it. Now, by the way, this is just as an aside. I keep referring to our culture's view and God's view. What I don't want you to hear from me today is that we as a church are supposed to fight our culture. We're not interested in culture wars. We're interested in interpreting our culture through a biblical worldview. You see, there's things in our culture we can celebrate because God's not afraid of our culture. And there's things within our culture that we have to stand back and say, no, that's just not it. And so we don't throw it out with everything. We engage, we embrace with the heart of Christ, the mind of Christ, with a biblical worldview. Are you with me on that? That was kind of out of place, but I just want to make sure I'm communicating clearly in this regard. 4 pillars of a godly sexuality. The first one is this: a godly sexuality reminds us of what we in truth long for. We long for, we have this built-in desire to experience what Adam and Eve experienced in the garden, to be naked and unashamed, to be completely open and vulnerable, to have nothing that we feel like we need to hide from each other. We long for this deep intimacy, this deep union with God Himself. And a godly sexuality reminds us, it points us to something greater, which is union with God. It reminds us that while people around us worship sex itself, we don't do that. We worship God. A godly sexuality points us right back towards Him. Second, a godly sexuality has a holistic integration of the entire person. A godly sexuality is experiencing intimacy, not just physically, but also intimacy in the heart, the mind, the soul, the strength, intimacy emotionally, intimacy within commitment to each other. A godly sexuality doesn't just say that the body is made for food and food for the body. You see the difference there? That disconnect of how our sexuality has been disconnected from all of these other things and has been seen to pursue nothing but physical gratification, that is what drives the pornography industry. And I've heard it said like this: the problem with pornography is not that it shows us too much, it's that it shows us far, far too little. You see, within that, you're not going to see anybody's hopes and dreams on display. You're not going to see anybody's inner feelings and soul on display. You're not going to see what God is doing within people's lives on display. You're not going to see their fears. You're not going to see their failures. You're not going to see their thoughts. You're not going to see their heart. All you're going to see is their body on display. It shows us far, far too little. And we have a whole generation of our youth that are raised up with it and think that that is the sum total of sexuality, church. We have so much to do. Third, a godly sexuality can be a form of a spiritual discipline. Because you see, a godly sexuality, enjoyed the way God created and God intended, does involve times of abstinence. And during that, as when God is shaping our mind, He is shaping our will, and that is when we remind ourselves, sex is not ultimate. We can be complete human beings without sex. Look to Jesus, the most complete human being who ever lived. We can be complete and whole without sex. The Bible tells us what we see modeled throughout. Sex is great. Don't get me wrong. God intended it for pleasure, but it points us to something far, far greater. It can be a form of spiritual discipline. Lastly, a godly sexuality is a witness to a watching world. It's a witness to a watching world, because you see, within a godly sexuality, that is to be a place, an area of respect. That is to be a place, an area of healing, an area of restoration, not an area of exploitation and abuse, which is what we see in our culture's view of sexuality. A godly sexuality brings hope It brings love. It brings an appreciation for the entire person, not just their physical, not just they physically acting out. In fact, as our world becomes more and more embraced and really just gorges itself on this idea of a relative truth, what's true for you may not be true for me, and about how our feelings fluctuate over time, therefore truth fluctuates over time, the permanence of a godly sexuality, the permanence of a beautiful marriage speaks volumes towards what they are looking for. Because they're looking for all the same things we are: hope, blessing, love. It's found within obedience. It's found within the permanence of a godly sexuality. Now, earlier I mentioned that our culture has a story on sex. It is telling a story. And God is telling a story too. And I want to share this with you. Now, I found this by another preacher named John Mark Comer, who I think did a phenomenal job with it. And I want to share it with you. And so we have this secular story, and then we have God's story. And here's how you compare the two. Our secular story starts out with this overall belief that humans are nothing but mere animals, that we've just evolved a little bit further along than other ones have. That humans as animals, we have no inherent dignity, no inherent worth, that we are just simply here purely as a product of chance. And so because of that, they would say that human nature has no ultimate meaning or purpose. That's why you hear the cries of people to define your own purpose, create your own meaning. Now, the logic behind that, if I have no meaning or purpose, how can I create it? It doesn't work. But that's what our secular story tells us. Our secular story tells us that male and female sex is nothing more than simple plumbing. It tells us that gender, the idea of gender, is a social construct that is to be interpreted with the times. It tells us that sex is just play for grown-ups, nothing more. It's just simply a biological release. And therefore, since it's play, we should be playing. That's the idea behind it. The secular story tells us that love is a feeling of happiness or sexual desire for another person. And that's it. That's what love is, nothing more. They would say that marriage itself is a social construct, and it's an outdated one because it was created by the patriarchy as a way for men to control and oppress women, and nothing more. In fact, an enlightened person would move away from this idea of marriage. The purpose of marriage is personal happiness, that my job to pursue within my marriage is my happiness. And if we cease finding it there, it says that divorce is a conscious uncoupling. It's an enlightened decision for folks that are no longer compatible or that have grown out of love. The call is to be true to yourself above all. The secular story looks at the Bible as a book full of sexism and racism. It looks to authority as oppression, and oppression that will keep you from happiness. It says that life is without meaning, life is an accident. Because of that, we're left with nature. We're left with this idea that God, if he exists, if he's anything, he's nothing more than a dead weight that keeps us from enlightenment. And this story is reinforced over and over again throughout culture and society, not through reality. Remember, our friends are starting to learn that this sexual story, it's failing, but it's enforced through culture, through society. The question that we're left to ask is this: is it true? Does it work? Does it bring about that which it promises? And when you look at the growing body of negative literature about the secular story of sexuality, you see it does not work. This idea that human beings have no value or no dignity, and using that as your starting place, that does not bring about any promise of life or joy or blessing. Christianity alone declares that humanity is complete, is a complete being in and of itself, with dignity and meaning, with all the dignity in the world, with all of the worth in the world. That's what we hold true. That's our secular story about sex. Jesus came around one day, and he told a story about sex. And these stories, they reflect the values behind them. Jesus' story begins with this, that humanity is not just merely evolved animals, that humanity are made in God's image, not mere apes, and that we are made human by the Spirit of God that is within us and by our own volitional will. Jesus' story tells us that human nature is good. Remember the garden. Remember the perfectness that existed there. However, it is bent by sin. We are not living the way that we are created to be. However, in spite of that, we have dignity and worth. Every single person you've ever seen, either met in person, on the TV, anywhere, read about in a history book, has all the dignity and worth in the world because God created them in his image. And Jesus came to set them free. Are you with me, oh church? Jesus' story says that the male-female sex, that within that, God has designed us as either male or female, and that God has blessed us within that. Now, this doesn't make light of the fact that there's a growing group of people who are struggling and wrestling with their gender identity. We don't just dismiss them. We remember people have dignity and worth, and we treat them with it. Jesus' story of sexuality recognizes that tension, recognizes that struggle, recognizes the pain that goes along with it. And Jesus says, I will walk with you through that. Because deep down, we are far, far more than our sexuality. That's not who we are. Deep down, we are children of God. And we all have different struggles and different everything. But Jesus meets us there, and he walks with us through it. Jesus' story says in regards to gender, men and women are equal in essence. In fact, this idea of feminism was an idea created by Jesus and by his followers. You see, the way that Jesus treated women was outright radical for his day. You see that throughout history, the moves and the organizations that were created to help the oppressed, women included and others, think of slaves and poor and on, that those organizations were created by followers of Jesus. Why would they create those if Jesus was this oppressive figure? That's not true. Jesus' story tells us that sex is so much more than physical. It's so much more than play. It is akin to making love. Now, it's not less than play. Remember, sex is to be enjoyed within the guidelines that God created. But it's so much more. That something happens at the soul level, this one flesh idea. And this idea of what Jesus is saying is being shown to be true over and over again over the past 10, 20, 30 years through what's known as attachment theory. This idea that we become attached to people that we engage in with sexually. I've seen, and you have seen, many marriages struggling deeply because one or both person has so many soul connections outside of that marriage. It is a intermingling of the souls. Jesus' view of sexuality holds that divorce, though sometimes it is necessary, there is room for divorce, but when it happens, something always dies. Often a relationship with a child or a relationship with God. While it is sometimes necessary, and while Jesus walks with us through it, it is not the ideal. It stands against our culture in that regard. Jesus tells us that love, while it is an emotion, it's so much more. In fact, a definition of love that I found that I thought was amazing is a decision of the heart to delight in another's soul and to will their good ahead of your own, no matter the cost. That's good right there, isn't it? A decision of the heart to delight in another's soul and to will their good ahead of your own, no matter the costs. It says that promiscuity, the message being communicated by promiscuity, is that neither one of us are worth a whole lot. Jesus' story says that marriage is not a contract that can be broken at will. It is a covenant. That within that covenant, we choose to love again and again and again, no matter what comes. That the purpose of marriage, the ultimate purpose, is not happiness. It's not personal happiness. That is a happy byproduct of a healthy marriage. but that marriage has so many more purposes that include friendship and partnership and family and sexuality. In fact, marriage is the only relational container that is strong enough to handle sexuality. And it's the only one that's good enough to frame the beauty of sex. That other purposes of marriage include spiritual formation in the wake of the fall. I've heard it said before, if you think you are perfect, get married. My married friends in here all know. Oh, I find out that I'm not. All right. Within marriage, your spouse knows the worst in you. They've seen you lose your temper. They've seen you lose your cool. They've seen the bad parts about you, and they choose to love you. They choose to be with you. That's what marriage does for us. Purpose of marriage is to reflect the love of Christ for his church. Jesus' story, when it talks about the Bible, it says that the Bible is the divine authority that leads us to Jesus. This authority that is sometimes tragically abused. Sometimes people take their Bibles and beat people up with them. That happens. That is not the ideal. That is not the intention behind the Bible. It is to be used well as a conduit to pass down wisdom, to rein in our flesh, and to live life to the full in every area and in sexuality. Jesus' story says that the meaning of life is to love. They asked Jesus, what's the most important commandment? Love God, love people. This decision to delight in another that I read earlier. The story of Jesus is a very different story than the one that is portrayed all through the world today, especially the Western world. And when we look at the data points of science and history, when we look at psychology, when we look at how well people are flourishing or not, according to which story that they live, we see more and more that it's Jesus' story that brings the blessing, that brings the freedom, the joy, the righteousness, and that it subverts the dominant narrative of our society and of sex. The question is not, do you have faith? But where do you put your faith? Do you put your faith in Jesus' story of sexuality and believe you'll find wholeness there? Do you put it in the secular view of society and believe you'll find wholeness there? Now, let me say, as a pastor, part of my role is that I interact with a lot of people, especially at the high moments of their life and the very low. I interact with a lot of souls in this way, and I have yet to find one that is experiencing flourishing, that is experiencing peace, that is experiencing joy while living out our secular story of sex. I have yet to find a single person that has been made complete through that. I have found several that are made complete through Jesus' story. There is something there. And once again, I say again, this is not an easy conversation. This is an awkward conversation. It can be an embarrassing conversation for many. Many of you probably grew up within church, went to Sunday school every single Sunday, and this might be the first message you've ever heard on sex. So it can be awkward. That's okay. We don't let that keep it away from us. We just acknowledge it's awkward, and we move forward with it. Because we don't want to be left out of this conversation and wonder why the dominant narrative is moving away from the narrative of Christ. The leadership team here at CenterPoint, we meet together, we discuss every single message, we pray into every message and every theme, including this one. And I wanted to let you know, the leadership team here at CenterPoint, we love you. And we want you to experience the flourishing that only comes through Jesus. That's the only way to find it. In fact, in light of this, and as we close, worship band, would you come back up here? I want us to close our service, our time together, in a way slightly different than what we've done in the past. You see, in the mind, with this idea that our society, our culture is telling a story, and God is telling a story, and that we are bombarded with our secular story everywhere we turn and everywhere we look, and that we have to be intentionally looking to find God's story of sexuality. In order to embrace it, what we need is a renewal of our minds. We need to ask God yet again, would you wash me? Would you make me clean? Yet again, Lord, would you remind me that there's something bigger going on? And so what I want to ask you to do, if you're able to, is I want to ask you to stand. I invite you to stand, and I want us to read a couple of verses together. They'll be right up here. These are well known for my Bible scholars. This is Romans 12, 1 and 2. I want us to read this out loud together. And as we do this, remember Jesus' story with sexuality. Remember God's heart with sexuality. And let's read this together. Therefore, I urge you, brothers and sisters, in view of God's mercy, to offer your bodies as a living sacrifice, holy and pleasing to God. This is your true and proper worship. Do not conform to the pattern of this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. Then you will be able to test and approve what God's will is, his good, pleasing, and perfect will. Stay standing for just a moment. As the world around us worships sex, we as Christ followers, we can say, sex is great. Sex is a gift, but it's not that great. It's not the ultimate. Instead, we look to the one that is eternal, the one who does rule and reign, the one who is God eternal, who lives throughout earth and heaven above. We look to the one that promises to give us all the joy and all the satisfaction and all the wholeness that is the desire of our heart. As we close out our time today, church, let's worship him and put our eyes squarely on him.